could bring partners of the Middle East together under the umbrella of the Abraham Accords, maybe it stops what has been centuries and centuries of violence and infighting amongst nations and peoples of the Middle East. I don't understand exactly how that works. You might not understand how that works. So let's find out more about these Abraham Accords. So we're going to go out to a Heritage Foundation expert joining us right now, Andrew Harding. He's a policy analyst in national security, and he's kind enough to join us right now on News Radio WRVA. Andrew, good morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you coming on. Abraham Accords. According to a lot of the news reports we see, that's really the linchpin that might be able to bring an end to the conflict with Iran. Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, we're trying to get the nations around Iran to agree to this, and maybe this will bring the end of this. Can you explain to our audience what the Abraham Accords are and why they're so significant in these talks?
Well, the Abraham Accords was one of the major diplomatic initiatives that President Trump led in his first administration around in 2020, in which he was able to help establish diplomatic relations and normalization between Israel and other Gulf countries, which initially included the United Arab Emirates as well as Bahrain. And now we're seeing some similar normalization agreements with Sudan and Morocco, in which what this does is it allows these Gulf countries to engage in diplomatic relations with Israel, establish trade and investment opportunities. There's flights, there's tourism, security cooperation, technology, energy partnerships, and the security elements notable, as we've just seen that recently during the Iran conflict, in which Israel was able to provide different missile technology and work with the UAE on missile defense, which is made possible through the Abraham Accords. Of course, and as you've mentioned, it's very important given the long-standing historical, cultural issues, religious tensions between Israel and other Gulf countries. So these agreements have been major breakthroughs throughout the first Trump administration, that it was continued throughout the Biden administration, and now again with President Trump back in office, is really pushing this as a potential avenue to help sustain a larger sense of stability in the Middle East after this conflict.
Simplify this for us, because you have Sunnis, you have Shias, you have Arab countries, you have Persian countries, you have Western democracies in Israel, you have authoritarian regimes, you have kingdoms. How can they all live under one umbrella with their divergent way of life and their different way of looking things and their governments and religious beliefs and try to have some kind of cooperation when you're looking at standing up to the one regime that's been importing terrorism and trying to put its thumb on everybody else's business like Iran?
Well, what these accords do is it exactly gets to that problem, in which it tries to cross over those divisions on a religious sense, a cultural sense, and try to find areas of common interest in which these countries have an interest in having a safer Middle East. There's a shared interest in ensuring that there's prosperity for their citizens. There's a shared interest in having cultural people-to-people exchanges where possible, whether it's flights, tourism. But at the end of the day, as you're noting, and that's what this Iran conflict is showing with regard to the Abraham Accords, that it is in the interest of these Gulf countries, even if they may have different disagreements with the government of the state of Israel, they recognize that there is a shared national interest in working with the government that can help keep Gulf countries safe, ensure their economies are more resilient, and we can ensure that in this case, we don't allow Iran in order to dictate what security looks like throughout the Middle East. So what Israel is showing here is that it is an excellent partner for Gulf countries to work with and a much better alternative to what Iran will do, where it's willing to weaponize the Strait of Hormuz and have terrorist proxy groups roam around the region, while Israel is focused on a peaceful and more stable Middle East. So it's a very good alternative that these accords offer.
Andrew Harding joining us right now from the Heritage Foundation. So for our listeners, is it a zero-sum game? Either you roll with Iran and the mullahs or you roll with Israel. You got to pick one or the other.
Not necessarily, in which some countries such as Saudi Arabia, for example, they have very strained relations with Iran, and they don't have necessarily formal ties with Israel, but they have been willing to be more open to degrees of normalization. So in the Middle East, it's a very complicated region in which you certainly have those that are willing to recognize Israel. You have countries that are a little more aligned with Iran, but for the most part, many are primarily interested in having stable economic revenues that allow oil to be exported throughout the region, rather than having, say, Iran being able to weaponize, say, the Strait of Hormuz or fire missiles or support terrorist proxy groups. So it is in these countries' interest, as I would argue, and some of my heritage colleagues would argue as well, that following through the Abraham's Accords will benefit the national interest of Gulf countries. So we've seen every single year since the Abraham Accords have been put into effect, trade has increased among those countries, ensuring greater prosperity for their people. So independent of whether a country wants to align with Israel, maybe they're open to different diplomatic relations with Iran or what that can look like, at the end of the day, these agreements advance their national interest.
I always look at these things, Andrew, and I always wonder if we're trying to mirror what Western democracy and our point of view is with people that don't share our Western democracy or way of thinking or point of view. So if this were to happen, I'll harken back to the days of the communist threat in the Cold War. We always worried about the domino effect. If Vietnam fell, Cambodia fell, then we'd have communism spread throughout the region. Could we also maybe look at this like a domino effect? If one country, one important country, were to join the Abraham Accords and have real relations with Israel and reject Iran, would the rest of the countries fall in line behind whoever that big dog is?
I think it would certainly help in that direction. And notably, when the agreements were first being announced in 2020 during the first administration, we saw Israel have diplomatic relations with the UAE as well as Bahrain. Those are two notable countries in the Gulf, and they've certainly been feeling the effects of Iranian missile strikes. So the precedent has been set. Now, it would be, say, valuable, as President Trump made clear in some of his recent Truth Social posts, that he would love to see more countries. I think he specifically hinted at Saudi Arabia and Qatar that should be two countries that side on. And I think it would be in their national interest. But as we've mentioned, it is very complicated. There is a very complex and complicated historical relationship. Of course, many of these Gulf partners have had different relations with the Palestinian Authority. It doesn't necessarily mean they support Hamas. But there is a distinction with the general regional history and cultural context around Israel, Gaza, etc. So it's a sensitive question with a complicated path. But looking forward, the Abraham Accords is going to help benefit the national interest of the countries that join.
Because I look at a country like Qatar, who's been in the middle of these negotiations, leading and maybe being the conduit. On one hand, they're looking like they want to work with the West. On the other hand, that's where Hamas's leadership is, I believe, and they have elements of Hezbollah that have been through there. So it seems like I'm dealing with people, but I'm not sure which side of the bed they're getting up on each day.
It's pretty complicated, isn't it? With all the how these different countries have woven in their different relations over many decades of time. But I think Qatar has realized, following certainly what's happened with the Iran war, that it wants to increasingly align more with the United States. That now we'll have to see if they're willing to make that jump to recognizing Israel diplomatically and having formal ties. But what we have seen, Iran has completely shot itself in the foot when one of its first moves in Operation Epic Fury in response was to launch missiles at Gulf partners, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, which really caused problems for these countries. Is rather than trying to find a middle ground, they realized, well, Iran is not someone we can work with. Instead, the United States and Israel are challenging the threat and, at the very least, are respecting their national interests and trying to keep a more stable and safer region. So we'll have to see, say, with Qatar in particular, how it aligns itself. Obviously, we don't want them working with Hamas. We don't think that's ideal. But we'll have to see if ultimately the president can get what he's seeking here of having these countries join the Abraham Accords.
But from the point of view of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, what's the appeal of Iran? What does Iran have to offer them that keeps them from jumping on the Abraham Accords and aligning with the West? What is Iran offering to these countries or threatening these countries that keep them from joining this coalition?
Well, some of it comes down to some of Iran's terrorist proxies, in which, as you know, there's Hezbollah, there's Hamas, there's the Houthis, and the different militant proxy groups that are lying throughout Iraq and throughout the region, in which some leverage Iran does have is it can direct these groups to complicate the internal affairs of these other Gulf countries, to engage in different terrorist attacks and so on. So that is one area of leverage, but more so that there's also it's independent of Iran, in which some of these countries don't necessarily view Iran as a good partner here. Iran is increasingly isolating itself from Gulf countries, in which at this point, probably the most of the different Middle Eastern countries that are currently involved with the conflict or have been impacted by it, Pakistan is likely the one that's been willing to speak most frequently with Iran here. The other Gulf countries are fed up with Iranian missile strikes on their oil infrastructure or civilian territories. So a lot of it, in addition to, yes, the leverage Iran may have, a lot of it comes down to these countries pursuing their national interest. Again, there is a complicated history. There is different relations with the Palestinian Authority over many decades. So it's a very complicated perspective. But primarily, if the Abraham Accords can prove how to benefit national interest, I think that is one of the best ways, in addition to President Trump's support and calling for this, we could see a potential breakthrough over time.
We only have 30 seconds. I'd love to be able to go into Lawrence of Arabia and Sykes-Picot and how the French and the English divided all this up, and we're still trying to figure that map out. But I just have one little question for you. I know Iran has the stick of the terrorist proxies. Do they have any carrots that they offer to anybody that says, hey, listen, come along with us, and here's your real benefit, tangible for your people and your government and your way of life?
Well, one of the primary carrots they'll try to lean on is oil, but primarily given the sanctions we put on, it ensures that it's very complicated for Iran to export its oil, say unless you're China buying it at a very cut rate because you'll evade the sanctions here. But that's something that Iran can try to offer as an economic interest here. But at the end of the day, Iran has proven it is not a reliable partner. It is weaponizing geography, launching missiles at these countries. So I think independent of how a deal may ultimately form and how the Abraham Accords may adjust, at the end of the day, Gulf countries recognize Iran is a challenge, it's a threat, and they don't want to align closer with it. Andrew,
really good synopsis of what's going on. So now we really understand where we are. These countries look, and, Iran has been so mischievous, if you will, causing mayhem and havoc. People don't want to poke that bear, and that's why they're able to stand there and have oxygen and not have the entire region turn against them. Now we really have a better understanding of that. I appreciate you coming on the program. We have to get you to come back on, though, because I do have a lot of questions about China as well, and what's going on there and how all of this relates interconnected throughout the world. So I hope we can get you back on the program again.
Absolutely. Would love to do so.
All right. Thank you so much. Andrew Harding joining us from the Heritage Foundation, our guest here on News Radio WRVA. Today's program brought to you in part by Loan Pronto. Oh, boy.